welcome to our deep dive. All about medieval theories of causation.
Causation.
Yeah. You sent over a ton of sources on this topic, so
Right.
get ready to kind of go back in time with us
Yeah.
and unpack how medieval philosophers thought about
Yeah.
the why behind everything.
It's a fascinating journey, and you might be surprised to find that these thinkers weren't just stuck in these outdated ideas.
Right.
They were grappling with some really complex questions that actually paved the way for modern science
Yeah.
and still shape how we think about the world today.
Absolutely. We're talking about, the big names like Aristotle, of course, but also
Right.
figures like Buridan, Scotus, and the ever-provocative Occam.
Oh, yeah. He's a troublemaker.
Yeah. So buckle up, because we're going to explore how their ideas about motion, the will,
Right.
even God, intertwined with their understanding of cause and effect.
I think a good place to start is by setting the stage a little bit.
Okay.
So imagine Europe in the Middle Ages. Philosophy was heavily influenced by Aristotle. And there was this drive, this real drive to understand the universe as a rational creation of God.
Okay, so it wasn't just about, abstract logic.
Not at all.
It was about seeing the world as this,
Yeah.
grand tapestry.
Yeah, a grand tapestry woven with purpose and order.
Yeah, okay, so it sounds like philosophy, theology, and what they called natural science back then
Yeah,
were all kind of intertwined.
absolutely. And a core concept that you'll find popping up again and again is hylomorphism.
Hylomorphism.
Yeah, it's the idea that everything is composed of matter and form.
Okay.
So think of it this way. You have a lump of clay, that's the matter,
Okay.
but when you shape it into a pot, the form of the pot is what gives it its specific function and makes it a pot,
Got it.
not just a random blob of clay.
Okay, so form is like the blueprint or the essence of a thing.
Yeah.
It's what makes it what it is and determines what it can do.
Yeah, you got it.
Got it. Okay, now let's talk about motion.
Motion.
And I'm not just talking about things moving around, right? Medieval philosophers had a much broader definition.
Much broader. Yeah, for them, motion referred to any kind of transformation,
Right.
growth, decay, even changes in knowledge or quality.
Okay.
An apple ripening on a tree,
Right.
that's motion, learning a new language motion.
Okay.
Aristotle and the medieval thinkers who followed him, they saw motion everywhere.
So it's any kind of change in the state of something.
Exactly.
Okay. But they also distinguished between different types of motion, right? Like natural motion versus violent motion.
Absolutely. So picture a rock falling to the ground.
Okay.
That's natural motion because it's driven by the rock's inherent property, its heaviness.
Okay.
But what about a projectile, like an arrow shot from a bow?
Yeah.
What keeps it moving once it leaves the bowstring?
That's what I was wondering. It doesn't seem as straightforward as a rock just falling.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Aristotle had this idea that the air surrounding the projectile rushed in to fill the void left behind,
Right.
sort of pushing it forward. But medieval thinkers like John Buridan started poking holes in that theory.
Wait, so they were already challenging Aristotle back then?
Oh, absolutely. Buridan, for instance, pointed out that heavier objects, which should be less affected by air movement, according to Aristotle's theory, actually travel farther when thrown.
Okay.
That didn't add up.
Right.
So they started developing the concept of impetus to explain projectile motion.
Impetus that rings a bell. It's like an internal force that's impressed upon the object when it's launched, right?
It's this inherent energy that keeps the object moving, and it gradually dissipates, causing the object to slow down and eventually fall back to Earth.
Okay.
It's a concept that foreshadowed some of the ideas we find in classical physics centuries later.
Wow. So they were already laying the groundwork for guys like Galileo and Newton.
And they were doing it all within the framework of medieval philosophy with its emphasis on forms and substances, agents and patience.
Okay.
They might have been revising specific theories, but they were still working within that same causal ontology.
So it's like they were updating the software while still using the same hardware.
Yeah, a good way to put it.
Now let's shift gears and talk about another fascinating area where they applied their theories of causation.
The human will.
Yes. The will itself was considered a type of motion, a change in the state of the soul.
Okay.
But this raised all sorts of tricky questions about self-motion and free will.
Okay, remind me, didn't Aristotle say that nothing can cause a change in itself?
You did?
So how did he explain how our wills could actually will anything?
Well, he argued that willed actions are triggered by a combination of beliefs and desires.
Okay.
So you see a delicious piece of cake, you believe it will be enjoyable, and you desire to eat it. Boom.
Yeah.
You reach for it.
Okay.
For Aristotle, the action was caused by those internal factors, not by the will acting independently.
So in a way, it sounds kind of deterministic.
It does,
Our choices are predetermined by our pre-existing beliefs and desires.
to a certain extent.
But wait, I thought some medieval philosophers pushed back against that idea. You're absolutely right. Thinkers like Anselm and later Scotus and Occam
Okay.
weren't satisfied with Aristotle's deterministic view. They argued that the will could be a self-mover capable of choosing between conflicting inclinations.
So even if I have like a burning desire for that cake,
Right.
my will can step in and say,
Exactly.
nope, not today.
Nope, not today.
Talk about free will.
Talk about free will. Scotus, for example, saw the will as having these two basic inclinations.
Okay.
One towards self-fulfillment, the other towards justice.
Okay.
These inclinations often conflict, and it's the will that ultimately steps in and makes the final call.
That's fascinating. So we have these internal forces pulling us in different directions.
Yeah.
And the will acts like a judge deciding which path to take.
A very good analogy.
But did they all agree about the extent of free will?
Not quite. Occam, always the radical, took it a step further.
Oh, I bet he did.
He argued that our actions are influenced but not necessitated by our ends. For him, a truly free agent is someone who could have chosen differently even under the exact same circumstances.
Wow. So even if I'm staring at that delicious cake, desperately wanting to devour it,
Yes.
I could still choose to resist?
You could.
That's some serious willpower.
Yeah. According to Occam, yes, he believed in radical free will,
Wow.
which of course has huge implications for how we understand morality and responsibility.
Right.
But before we go down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
let's shift our focus to another key area of medieval thought, perception.
Okay.
Because how we perceive the world also plays a role in how we understand causality.
Right. It's all connected. So how did they view perception back then, and how did they think it tied into the whole idea of cause and effect?
That's where things get really intriguing. They had this theory going back to Roger Bacon called the species theory.
Species theory, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so last time we left off with this mysterious species theory. What exactly were these species,
Yeah.
and how did they fit into the medieval understanding of perception?
Right. So think of it this way. Imagine you're looking at a rose.
Okay.
According to this theory, the rose emits a kind of immaterial imprint of itself, a species
Okay.
that travels through the air and into your eyes.
Okay.
It's like a tiny invisible replica of the rose
Okay.
that allows you to perceive its color shape and even its fragrance.
So it's not the rose itself that I'm directly perceiving,
Right.
but rather this like rose-likeness
Yeah.
that somehow made its way into my brain.
Exactly.
That's wild.
It is a wild concept, and it dominated medieval thought for centuries.
Oh.
But some thinkers, like Henry of Ghent and Duns Scotus, started raising some serious objections.
Okay.
They argued that maybe perception was more about the relationship between the object, the perceiver, and these species,
Okay.
rather than a literal transfer of tiny replicas.
So it's less about like a physical copy
Yeah.
and more about some kind of interaction or connection that's happening.
Exactly. They were trying to refine the theory and make it more philosophically sound. And then along came Occam, who, as usual, decided to shake things up even more.
Oh, I bet he did. He wasn't one to shy away from a good philosophical debate.
No, he wasn't.
So what was Occam's take on all of this?
Well, he just straight up rejected the existence of species altogether.
Whoa. Okay.
He argued that we don't need these extra entities to explain perception.
Okay.
Instead, he proposed this idea of action at a distance.
Wait, so he's saying that objects can directly influence each other without anything passing between them?
That's what he's saying.
That sounds pretty radical for a medieval thinker.
It was, but remember, Occam was all about simplicity.
Oh.
He was famous for his razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the best.
Right.
He saw these species as unnecessary complications, so he just shaved them right off.
Okay, so Occam liked to keep things clean and streamlined.
Yeah, he liked to cut to the chase.
But didn't this also lead him to some pretty controversial views on causality?
You're right on the mark. This brings us to another fascinating aspect of medieval philosophy. You see, there's this common misconception that Occam had a very modern, almost Humean view of causality.
Yeah, I've heard that too. But I have a feeling it's not that straightforward.
You're right to be skeptical.
Right.
The Humean argument, to put it simply, says that causality is nothing more than observing patterns.
Okay.
We see event A happen, then event B happen, and we conclude that A causes B.
Right.
but there's no necessary connection, no guarantee that B will always follow A.
Yeah, it's like the rooster crowing before sunrise. Just because it happens regularly doesn't mean the rooster is causing the sun to rise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, while Occam did question the idea of a separate thing called causality,
Okay.
he didn't reduce it to mere patterns or constant conjunction.
Okay.
He still saw causality as a real relation between entities.
So it's more than just observing sequences of events.
Right.
But it's not some mysterious force linking them either.
Yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
It's a tough one, and this is where we see a key difference between medieval and modern thought. Medieval philosophers weren't as concerned with how our minds perceive causality
Okay.
or construct concepts.
Right.
They were more interested in the actual objective relations between things in the world.
So it's less about the psychology of perception and more about the ontology.
Yeah,
What really exists and how those things relate to each other.
you got it. They were grappling with the fundamental structure of reality,
Okay.
not just how we happen to experience it.
Okay.
Now, there's another common misconception about Occam that we need to address.
Okay.
The idea that he completely rejected final causes.
Final causes, refresh my memory on what those are.
The idea that things have purposes or ends that drive them.
Okay.
For example, an acorn grows into an oak tree because its purpose is to become an oak tree.
So it's about the why behind things.
Yeah.
The goal or aim that they're directed towards.
Exactly. Now, you might think that Occam, with his emphasis on efficient causes,
Okay.
the direct mechanical causes that make things happen, would have no place for final causes. But it's not that simple.
So he didn't just throw the whole concept of purpose out the window.
Not quite. Remember, he was deeply engaged with Aristotle's philosophy, which is steeped in teleology.
Okay.
The idea that the universe is inherently purposeful. Occam didn't just abandon that entire framework.
So how did he reconcile these seemingly conflicting ideas?
Well, it's a complex issue that scholars are still debating,
Yeah.
but it seems that he saw final causes as a kind of shorthand, a way of describing the inherent tendencies of things that ultimately stem from their efficient causes.
Okay, so instead of saying that the acorn grows into an oak tree because it's destined to be an oak tree,
Right.
he might say that it grows because of the specific mechanisms and processes,
Yeah,
the efficient causes operating within it,
exactly.
causes that are naturally oriented towards producing an oak tree.
Precisely. It's like saying that the acorn's structure and properties, its efficient causes,
Sure.
are such that it naturally develops into an oak tree. The final cause, the oak tree itself, is a result of those efficient causes working themselves out over time.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between describing the blueprint of a house,
Yeah.
the final cause, the intended outcome,
Right.
and describing the actual construction process
Yeah.
with all its specific steps and materials, the efficient causes.
A perfect analogy.
Okay,
And this brings us to another crucial aspect of medieval thought,
right.
the role of God in the causal framework.
Okay.
After all, if the world was created by God, does that mean everything is predetermined?
Right.
Where does free will fit in?
Those are some big questions.
They are big questions.
And I bet medieval philosophers had some pretty ingenious ways of addressing them.
Oh, they did.
All right, so we've been talking about how medieval philosophers viewed causation, and now we're getting into the really big questions. Like, how does God fit into all of this? If God created the world, does that mean everything is predetermined?
That was a major puzzle for them, for sure. But they came up with some pretty insightful ways to tackle this problem. One key distinction they made was between God's absolute power and his ordered power.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
God's absolute power is, well, absolute, it's unlimited. He could create a world with completely different laws of nature where things behave in ways we can't even imagine.
So absolute power is like God in creative mode. No rules, just pure possibility.
Exactly. But then there's God's ordered power. This is the power he exercises within the framework of the world. He created a world governed by laws and principles that reflect his rational nature.
So ordered power is like God playing by the rules of the game he set up.
Precisely. It's the power he uses to maintain the order and regularity we see in the world. This distinction was key for medieval philosophers because it allowed them to reconcile God's omnipotence with the idea of necessary causal connections.
So they could say that things happen in a predictable, law-governed way, even though God could, in theory, make them happen differently if he wanted to.
You got it. They could affirm God's absolute power to do anything, while also acknowledging that in the world we experience things operate according to the laws he established. This gave them a powerful tool for exploring complex issues like free will and divine providence.
So it's like God created the game board and the rule book, but then he lets the game play out according to those rules, even though he could change them at any moment.
A perfect analogy, and this distinction applies not just to physical laws, but also to moral and spiritual matters. God could force everyone to be good if he wanted to, but he chooses to give us free will, which means we have the capacity to choose between right and wrong.
That makes sense. So God's ordered power is almost like a self-imposed limitation. He chooses to constrain his own actions to create a world where free will and moral responsibility are possible. That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is, and this, of course, leads to all sorts of fascinating theological and philosophical debates about the nature of free will, divine providence, and the problem of evil topics that philosophers are still wrestling with today.
Whoa, this is getting deep. But it also shows how much depth there is to these medieval theories of causation. They weren't just abstract ideas, they were connected to big questions about the nature of reality, the role of God, and the meaning of human existence.
Exactly. And while their answers might not always align with our modern perspectives, their way of thinking, their emphasis on logic and reason, and their willingness to tackle profound questions had a lasting impact on the development of Western thought.
It's inspiring to see how these thinkers from centuries ago were grappling with ideas that are still relevant today. It shows that the search for knowledge and understanding is a timeless pursuit.
Absolutely. And as you continue exploring the world of philosophy, keep in mind the insights of these medieval thinkers. Their ideas might surprise you, challenge you, and even inspire you to see the world in new and unexpected ways.
So, to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into medieval theories of causation. We hope you've gained a new appreciation for the complexity and depth of these ideas.
And remember, the quest for knowledge is never ending. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the universe.